Welcome to the program, and welcome back to part 2 of my conversation with Gustavo Ribeiro, a Brazilian journalist and the co-founder of the Brazilian Report. As a reminder, he is an award-winning trilingual journalist, English, French, and Portuguese, co-founder of the Brazilian Report, a news website since 2017 that explains Brazilian politics and economics to a foreign audience. He has a team of journalists who have won international awards for their work. His experience includes writing about Brazil and international affairs for both Brazilian and European media outlets, covering events including terrorist attacks and presidential elections. He has also worked for senatorial and gubernatorial campaigns in Brazil, so a real insider from a journalist perspective and somebody who has worked in the political arena in that country before. So for those who caught part 1 of my interview in the previous episode, and I encourage you to go back and listen to that if you've missed it, and this is the first time you're catching the show. Part 1, we talked about internal Brazilian politics, the state of economics, societal and social issues in the country, including things like their relationship with the indigenous population of the country. In this interview, we now turn our attention to Brazilian foreign policy, and that includes their desires to be a regional player in Latin America, their challenges in their own backyard with countries like Venezuela, and how they're looking at international issues, challenges, whether it's how they're looking to play or not in the conflict in the Middle East, how they're looking to interact with countries like China and Russia that are natural adversaries to the United States and Western Europe, but who have potentially some benefits to offer a country like Brazil in its part of the world. So we spend some time walking through all the different foreign policy issues facing the country. Gustavo gives us a insider's perspective from the everyday Brazilians, but also how the government is thinking about these challenges and issues. And we walk through a number of these topics, including a few that might be more salient to our European and American audiences, but I think we did the best we could in this conversation to keep the topics global so that they're relevant for everybody wherever you're listening. So if you have an interest in Brazil, frankly, if you have an interest in the view from Latin America on geopolitical matters, this is the conversation for you. So without further delay, I present to you part 2 of my conversation with the Brazilian Report co-founder, Gustavo Ribeiro. So I want to turn our attention now to foreign affairs and foreign policy. Brazil, obviously the largest country by landmass. I believe it is the largest economy in Latin America. Is that right?
Yes.
So obviously has an outsized influence in the region. So let's start there. Let's start close to home. As we're recording this program, there have been very controversial elections in Venezuela. Brazil has been one of the voices, along with Mexico and others, that have been trying to handle this among the community of Latin American nations. But there's a lot of attention from as far away as the Russians and the Chinese, who were quick to congratulate the sitting President Maduro on a likely fraudulent reelection. And then the Americans, of course, came in and tried to recognize the opposition figure for whom there's a lot of data to support that person won the race. Really interested to hear the perspective from Brazil, both the government and the ordinary citizens of Brazil, how they're viewing this moment in time in Venezuela, as well as the larger issues of the last decade plus that have sent, unfortunately, a lot of Venezuelans into neighboring countries and scattered them around the world, and the implications that has had for the region.
So Venezuela is quite of a pickle for Lula and his government because Venezuela experienced such a tremendous socioeconomic crisis over the past few years, and actually was the center stage of the biggest migration crisis in the Western Hemisphere as of late. It has become a sort of a boogeyman for the right wing in many Latin American countries to bash left wing policies. So they always say, well, if the left does what they want to do, we'll become the next Venezuela. So, and that has actually taken hold in people's imaginary. In addition to that, there's the fact that Lula and his Workers' Party, they have always been supportive of left-leaning regimes. However, anti-democratic they may be. So when, for instance, Nicaragua had elections in 2021, I'm sorry, the Workers' Party congratulated that as a great display of democracy, despite the government having jailed several opponents that were possible challengers. And then the Workers' Party has always been supportive of Maduro in Venezuela. When Maduro came to Brazil last year. He was showered with praise by Lula. Lula said that claims that he's undemocratic are narratives from the U.S. and that actually the problems that Venezuela have nothing to do with the dictatorship, but just because U.S. sanctions are hamstringing the country. Uh, Now, that Maduro relationship is something that really rubs Brazilian voters the wrong way. And so when Venezuela has these elections where every single piece of evidence points to fraud, then how does the government react? And Brazil actually chose a sort of wait and see approach. And uh, for one, because it believes that being very confrontational will only push Maduro to sever ties with Brazil, and that is bad diplomacy for Brazil because we share a major border with Venezuela. The Brazil's northernmost state buys energy from Venezuela. There are migrants from Venezuela coming into Brazil, so talks between Brasilia and Caracas are necessary for both countries, but also because Lula does not want to call a buddy of his a dictator. So that also plays into the equation. And we have many people in the opposition trying to grill government officials in Congress to say, okay, why are you not calling that as it is? And so that is a problem. There is also a problem, if I may. I know you wanted me to talk more about Brazil and the region, but there is also a problem for the Workers' Party future because so Lula is 70, almost 78 years old. Um, I mean, he is in the twilight of his career, and the Workers' Party should be preparing for the post Lula and showing them that they are moderates. That I mean, they are social democrats, like regular social democrats. They're not the communists that will eat your children type that the far right tries to paint as. Um, and then when they lend their support to Maduro, they are giving the opposite impression for many voters. And once they don't have a guy with the star power of Lula, then that becomes a real liability because Lula can trump a lot of these problems that the party has because he is who he is. And but the Workers' Party has not a second Lula to rely upon. So that's another problem.
So, as you look at Brazil's place in the region, one would think it has outsized diplomatic influence, but in reality, Latin American countries are not like the European Union. There's not as formal of a structure where some of these issues can be worked out. There's not a equivalent of the European Union for regulations. Countries are still very free to do what they want, and there are a broad range of political viewpoints all throughout Latin America. So, how is Brazil navigating this, and to what degree do they want to be the big player that represents all of Latin America, and to what degree do they want to just stay focused on the issues that are important to everyday Brazilians and leave other regional issues to those countries to deal with?
Well, Brazil has always wanted to be a regional leader, but like you said, South America is not integrated as Europe. So we don't have anything like the European Union, but we have a trade alliance called the Mercosur, which is between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia has just joined. But the problem is that these countries have very different interests, very different strategies for diplomacy, for trade. And these countries are starting to see that they need each other less and less. Because China is becoming their biggest trading partner, they don't need actually to rely on each other for selling goods, for having strong trade surpluses. and so they are focusing less and less in regional integration. Also, whenever you have um, presidents from different sides of the aisle, that also makes relations become very contentious. So Brazil and Argentina, who are historical allies, have been at odds for many years because at one point we had a left-wing president in Argentina and a right-wing president in Brazil, and then the other way around right now. Um, and for instance, this Mercosur alliance is on the verge of implosion because by the bylaws of Mercosur establish that trade deals must be negotiated collectively. But because each one wants to go to a separate direction, you already have Uruguay saying, okay, we are going to negotiate a trade deal with China on our own. If Mercosur wants to join us, great. If not, who cares? Argentina has a president that wants to implode the Mercosur, and then Lula tries to hold everything together. One major setback is the fact that a huge trade deal between Mercosur and the European Union is almost certain not to get enacted because of French opposition to cater to French farmers who don't want their markets invaded by South American agricultural products. That would bring a new lifeline to Mercosur, but because it's not going to be materialized, I think even that frail alliance is on the verge of breaking up. And yes, I mean, a lot of our countries, they have their diplomacies dictated by who is in power. It's not necessarily a state policy, but a government policy. So there are so many shifts and turns, and that it makes any integration effort so much more difficult.
Are there issues regionally beyond the ones that make the headlines around the world, like Venezuela? Occasionally, we'll hear about challenges or issues that are very specific to a point in time, whether it's Honduras or Nicaragua. Are there other nations, though, that Brazil is particularly focused on either strengthening its ties with, or they have some challenges that they'd like to deal with, just in their own backyard?
So Brazil is now focused on creating a network, an infrastructure network, connecting it to countries in the Andes, because it believes that a passage to the Pacific will make trade much more effective and will make Brazilian products much more competitive, especially if you want to ship them to China. It will lower shipping costs by almost a third if you can move goods to Peru and then from Peru to China. So the Brazilian government has launched late last year a project to integrate Brazil to Chile, Peru, Ecuador. Um, Now, this is not the first integration plan that we have seen. I mean, from the top of my mind, this is the third one I remember, and the other two were other failures because once you change an administration, then this priority is no longer a priority, and uh, projects that you already have spent billions of dollars on go to the back burner and then never see the light of day. So uh, the government hopes that by 2026 it will have a route to ship soybeans directly to Peru and then China. But I mean, I'll believe it when I see it.
Fair enough. Let's talk about Brazil's relationship with the United States, another complicated one that can change with administrations. This has been an important economic relationship, I think, for both parties. But give us the view from Brazil about how they're thinking about America's current election, but also just how they view America's role, whether it be positive or negative, quite frankly, in the region and around the world.
So historically, and this is not a left or right thing, Brazil has always wanted to be close to the U.S., but not too close to the U.S. It has always tried to keep the U.S. in an arm's length, also because Brazil always wanted to be this regional power, and so oversized influence in South America is a problem for that goal. Now, granted, in recent decades, the U.S. has not cared so much about South America. Latin America in general, I think policies towards Latin America are almost exclusively focused on immigration issues, but not necessarily other broad economic issues. And for South America, that has been especially the case. Um, Now, Brazilian and U.S. relations have an interesting thing that when even if you have presidents from the other side of the aisle, it doesn't mean that the relations are going to be bad. So when you had George W. Bush in office, you had Lula. So I mean, they don't see eye to eye on many things, but they had a good personal relationship. Relations were good in many ways. But for instance, we had in the 90s Fernando Henrique Cardoso as our president and Bill Clinton in the U.S. I mean, they saw eye to eye on most kind of policies, but the relationship was bad between the two countries. Now, if Trump gets elected, then it becomes more problematic because of how vocal Lula has already been about Trump, about how he thinks Trump is a radical, a fascist. Um, so I do believe that relations could be problematic. But also, Brazil has a very professional diplomatic corps, and I think it would try to keep relations as normal as possible because the U.S. Not only is Brazil's second biggest trading partner, but it's the biggest buyer of Brazilian manufactured goods. And in a country that is going through the industrialization, you don't want to vex the guys who buy your manufactured goods the most. So I think that uh, uh, Lula does a lot of lip service, throws a lot of red meat to his left-wing constituents, but he is, at the end of the day, a pragmatic. So I don't think that Brazil would try to rock the boat too much, even if Trump wins. Of course, the Democrats would be much closer to Lula in terms of how they see the economy and especially social issues.
So we have heard in English-speaking Western countries a lot about the old BRICS alliance, which Brazil was the B in BRICS, and of course Russia, India, China, South Africa had big roles to play in that. I wouldn't say we've heard a lot in more recent times. So how did the Brazilians view this? I mean, was this really a alliance of any form, or was this more of just countries that came together for some periods of time when they had common interests to be somewhat of a counterweight to Western Europe and the U.S.? But certainly over the last number of years, just given the issues specifically with Russia, and they've become much more isolated in the international community. India seems to be much more focused on their own backyard. China has a strong relationship in Latin America, but has many interests. How do you see that? And maybe even if you want to take it to the concept that's been thrown around about the global South, that Brazil and India and certain nations are natural allies and they'd naturally be aligned in international affairs. But that seems like a very overly simplistic view of how Brazil sees itself in the world as a whole beyond the Americas.
So the BRICS alliance is quite important because it has yielded a lot of results for these countries. So we have a BRICS bank that is financing infrastructure in these countries. Uh, Now, granted, the BRICS has become China and Co. in recent years, right? It has become a Chinese instrument for influence. But for Brazil, it is a very strategic group because Brazil, and that is particularly the case with the Lula administration, believes that the country is growing more and more multipolar. So it wants to be equidistant from the US, Europe, China, and Russia. Not too much on one side, not too much on the other side, in order to profit from whatever both sides can give you. That is, for instance, how Brazil operated during World War II. Brazil kept itself neutral for the first part of the war, and actually was negotiating both with the Nazis and the Allies. Okay, because Brazil for the Atlantic part of the portion of the war had a strategic location in the northeast for Air Force bases. So Brazil was like, okay, you can use my territory for Air Force operations, but who is going to give me more? So the Brazilian steel industry is born from that, from this bargaining between the two sides, and by the end, the U.S. paid for the birth of the Brazilian steel industry. And many people defend that that's what we should be doing with the US and China. Not be pro China, not be xenophobic, not be anti US, but not be too aligned with the US. And Lula has, uh, I mean, gotten out of his way to mark this position of non alignment, giving several statements that have shocked some Western powers. How he handled the war in Ukraine, for instance, or saying that both Ukraine and Russia are equally to blame for the war, saying that the U.S. and Europe want the war to keep dragging on in order to exert their influence, or by comparing Israel, what Israel is doing in Gaza, to what the Nazis did to the Jews in World War II. So he's even if sometimes he rubs Western powers the wrong way, I think what Brazil really wants is to be in a place where it can profit from being on good terms with both China and Russia, but also with the U.S. and Europe.
How does Brazil view its national security interests? It doesn't seem to be a country that has any immediate threats in its neighborhood. I mean, it's not a place that's going to get invaded anytime soon. But certainly, like any country, there have to be interests defended, and they must look abroad at trade relationships and others that must be defended. How does Brazil look at its defense industry, its defense policy? Are there any watch out areas where they do go out of their way to take a more defensive position just in case the world takes a turn against them?
There is a big fear in Brazil that the Amazon is being coveted by major powers, and that Brazil must protect it at all costs. That has been the case since the 1800s. So there was always this idea that they are going to try to steal the Amazon from us. The army has a large presence in the Amazon rainforest, and many groups, especially on the right, but also between military circles, believe that uh, the discourse from developed countries around environmental issues and around what some see as Brazil's inability to zero deforestation in the Amazon as a sort of um, a cover for trying to actually get their hands into the Amazon and say, okay, you cannot manage the rainforest. Let us do that for you. Of course, the Amazon has enormous potential in terms of biodiversity for the pharma industry, for the agricultural industry, the mining industry. So that's something that really is front and center in the imaginary of Brazilians, that oh, they are trying to steal the Amazon. They want to steal the Amazon from us. I mean, who is they depends on which side of the aisle you're on, but that's something that you see quite a lot in Brazil.
And are there any issues that you do not see talked about internationally that are very important to Brazilians? This could be domestic or international, that you talk about on a regular basis or people in Brazil discuss, but you've not seen covered well in international press.
Well, I think that the international press, when they are covering Brazil, they really miss the mark on how our politics work, um, because there's a very unique way of doing things in Brazil. Uh, First, it's interesting because one thing that is a sort of scourge of the Brazilian political system, in some ways, it was also what saved Brazilian democracy from an even steeper anti-democratic backsliding. So Brazil has one of the most fragmented legislatures in the world. We elected almost 30 parties to Congress last time, and like I said, I mean, these parties are not real parties. Sometimes, like you see the Brazilian Labor Party, and this has actually become a far right party. And then you see the Brazilian Women's Party, which was only run by men. So you have these bizarre parties that actually what their names does not necessarily mean anything, does not necessarily mean they stand for X or Y issue. Um, and we have this sort of group called the Big Center. And the Big Center is a loose association of these um, ideologically fluid parties that they are as comfortable aligning themselves with the left as they are with the right, depending on the perks they're going to get in return. And that's actually, uh, they are um, inevitable for any president. You can only govern Brazil if you get on their good graces. And that has been the case for Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the center-right president in the 90s, Lula, the left-wing guy in the 2000s, and so on and so forth. Now, um, that is a deterrent for progress in Brazil because every time you're going to change anything, you have to water it down immensely because these parties always trying, they're always representing one interest or another. They're always trying to chip away at broad legislation. So our tax reform took 30 years to pass and is being watered down by every day. But at the same time, when we had Jair Bolsonaro in office, um, so Bolsonaro was, um, I mean, let's see if Trump gets elected, how he's going to act. But I would argue he was more radical than Trump. He was more radical than some of the far left, far right guys that got to power in many countries. And he wanted really to dismantle the Brazilian state in many ways. He wanted to co-opt the military for him, and now we know that there was a plan. I mean, because of federal investigations, we know that there was literally a plan to enact a coup d'état after the 2022 election. But because the Brazilian system is so fragmented, and because nobody does anything if they don't get something in return, that also deterred Bolsonaro from being able to pass the reforms he wanted to pass in order to reduce social protections in Brazil, in order to change some of the tax structure in Brazil. So that limited the damage that Bolsonaro was able to do over the 4 years of his presidency. So I think that studying this big center, how it operates, how it de- how its operations in Congress also depend a lot on local issues that lawmakers have within their own constituencies. I think that's something that whenever we're covering Brazil from abroad, we tend to miss the mark and oversimplify it and say, well, the Brazilian Congress is just 600 crooks, all everyone trying to get something, and it's more complex than that. I think there are a lot of people. Of course, there are many crooks, but there are people that what they are asking in return is not necessarily money on their pockets, but like a hospital for their constituency. So there's a lot of different things and complex political relationships that I think are tend to be overlooked by the foreign press, which we try at the Brazilian Report to do that and to explain with context why things are done a certain way and why I think and I think people from many other Latin American countries would relate to what I'm saying. Why what we do is not weird or bizarre or less developed just because we do it in a different way. And I mean, of course, we have miles to go in terms of inequality, in terms of fighting corruption, but I do think there's a tendency to fetishize this problems when we're looking Brazil and Latin America from abroad.
Very fair. So let's wrap on this. You are a journalist, so therefore you're asking questions all the time and thinking about the next story. What has you interested, maybe over the next several months, maybe over the next year, something that's maybe not in the headlines now, but you're starting to ask questions or look into that you think we should be looking out for maybe over the next few months or the next year or so?
I would say for the next few years, I am eager to find out what is going to be the post Lula Workers' Party. This is the only real party that we have in Brazil, and it has this larger than life guy who is like the sun around which the party revolves. And I mean, he's in the final stage of his political career. Who is going to step up and I mean, what will the party continue to be as strong as it has been over the past few decades without that guy? I think that this question will determine how the Brazilian political system will evolve from now on. And I don't think we have an answer for that question right now because it will depend on how will Lula finish this term. Will he get another term in 2026? How the economy is going to look like after that. And depending on these questions, is going to be an easier route to find a replacement or is going to be the party's demise.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for taking all this time with us today. If people would like to learn more about you and your work and the Brazilian Report, where can they go to follow you?
So you can go to Brazilian.report, and we have original coverage on Brazil and Latin America every day. Or you can also go to any place you get your podcasts and look for Explaining Brazil, which is our weekly podcast on Brazilian politics, economics, and society.
Well, I know I'll be subscribing for sure. We'll put links to both of those in the description of this program, and we'll share them, of course, on our website and our social media channels as well. Gustavo, thank you so much for taking time to walk us through all things Brazil. We look forward to having you back again because we know all these topics are rapidly evolving. And so it won't take long for us to have new issues to discuss and new international affairs to see how the Brazilians are looking at them.
It was a pleasure, and I'd gladly be back for another hour of talking Brazil. I'm always passionate about it, so it's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I certainly hope you found that conversation as fascinating to listen to as it was for me to conduct. So much learning came out of these last two episodes about internal Brazilian politics and how they view geopolitics, their place in the world. There's two big takeaways from that. There's things I want to share with you that I learned in the process of doing that interview, and I don't think I really had paid as much attention to before. You know, when I was asking about national security challenges, I was thinking about that in the conventional sense of, military or perhaps cybersecurity threats that the country feels like it may face, whether it's its own region or interests abroad. But very interesting to hear that from a Brazilian internal perspective, the Amazon rainforest itself and international interest in it is a national security issue from a Brazilian perspective. They feel a great sense of ownership and stewardship of the world's largest rainforest and how important it is strategically for them and how important it is to the planet as a whole, given the issues of climate change and the role that a rainforest like the Amazon plays. So I hadn't really thought about an ecological perspective to international affairs, but it's a very, very important point. And I also really hadn't spent much time thinking about the future of the major political parties in Brazil. I had alluded to in a previous episode, as we talked about Latin America with Fulton Armstrong a couple of episodes ago, that I believe that the region is ripe for a new generation of leaders to emerge. For some reason, Brazil wasn't top of mind for me, but when you think about where they are and how we just ended that conversation, what happens after these larger-than-life figures like Jair Bolsonaro and Lula are no longer in the picture? They have absolutely dominated Brazilian politics for a decade. And actually Lula's been around longer than that. Who is next in line? It feels like perhaps Brazil could be that place that I was just talking about, where a younger and future-looking leader could potentially emerge. And I guess I hadn't thought about them front and center, but given the size of the economy, the size of the country, the importance they play, what better place for a leader of the Americas to emerge that perhaps can take a stronger leadership role regionally and not just in Brazil itself. So a lot to learn out of that conversation. If you like what you heard here, please share this with others. Anybody in the geopolitical community or those who are just interested in international affairs and you don't think media does a good job covering those. I live in the United States. All due respect to media partners in the U.S., mainstream traditional media, just generally speaking, doesn't do a very good job covering most international affairs outside the U.S. A lot of our evening newscasts, even morning news shows, even local news shows, they're very, very focused on tabloid stories around our politicians and whatever the big flashy headline, maybe the disaster headline is. Just not a lot of time spent on international affairs. We try to do that on this program in an in-depth way. So it's both educational and informative. Now, we're not here delivering the news. We are trying to give you a bigger picture, a trend line, overall perspectives on different parts of the world from voices that you may not often hear on traditional media, but certainly not the conspiratorial types or people who are not credible to speak on it. We bring on guests like Gustavo, who is experienced, seasoned, a responsible journalist who thinks about the facts, who shares perspectives from multiple points of view. And that's one of the great values that we think there is to the podcast format and to this program. So if you like what you heard, if you know people who are frustrated that they can't get these types of stories anywhere else, send them over to our show. You can find all of my programs, including every episode that we have posted just like this one, on my subscription feed. Anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the Odyssey app. If you prefer Amazon Music, we're available there. And of course, one of our partners here is Libsyn. That is the service that provides our podcast feed. So you can always find our show there as well. And we post all of our episodes to YouTube. So it's very easy. If you're just scrolling through looking for the latest videos, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. It's at Brian J. Matos Podcast. And if you subscribe there, just like you do on any other podcast platform, you'll be the first to know when new episodes are posted. We also post short form clips. So in case you want to share a portion of our show with one of your friends, you can do that there. It's also a very easy place to find that one portion of the show that you'd like to share. Just find that on the tracker. Then you can have that clip start from that exact point, and you can just share the link that starts at that exact timestamp with your friends. So that's a nice benefit of using YouTube. If you would like to have more information on me or the program, my website is brianjmatos.com, and you can always reach out to me directly if you have questions about the program, or if there's a recommendation or a suggestion you have, maybe somebody you'd like me to interview and have on the program. You can send me a note at info@brianjmatos.com. Thank you again for listening to this program. We look forward to having you back again for our next conversation. And until then, I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.